lonely rancher took in 16-year-old girl who was left tied to a fence by her father. The ground had frozen overnight, hard as old regrets, and the Wyoming wind carried a silence that wasn't empty, but waiting. Samuel Hayes didn't usually step out early. He didn't much care for mornings or what they reminded him of. But that day, he was out before the frost had melted, coffee cooling in one hand, the weight of nothing in the other, until he saw her. At first, she looked like a pile of rags caught on his split-rail fence. But as he got closer, the shape didn't shift in the wind. It breathed. A girl, maybe 16, tied by the wrists, her skin a pale gray against the cold wood. Her head tilted toward him slightly, but she didn't flinch or cry for help. Just stared, hollow-eyed, as if something inside her had left hours before her body got the message. Samuel stopped. In all the years he'd lived alone out here, he'd seen coyotes dragged down calves, seen lightning take out a barn in one strike. But he'd never seen this. Human cruelty this raw, this deliberate, left out in the open like it was nothing. His fingers tightened around the handle of his pocket knife. He didn't ask who she was or how she got there. Didn't call for help either, because out here, help didn't come easy and the law came even harder. You didn't involve others unless you were ready to give something up. He wasn't sure what this girl had left to give. The ropes came loose without a word. She collapsed like silence, like surrender. Samuel caught her before she hit the dirt, startled by how light she felt, as if she'd been disappearing for days. He carried her to his cabin, each step weighed not by her body, but by the questions he didn't dare ask yet. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't shake. Just lay curled on his couch wrapped in the old quilt his late wife had made, her presence already unsettling the dust that had claimed his life over the years. And in that stillness, something shifted. Samuel didn't know her name, but he knew her kind of silence. The kind born from being broken too young, too many times. The kind that didn't want saving, just space to survive. That morning, he didn't rescue anyone. He just opened a door. The girl didn't stir until late afternoon. By then, the wind had changed and the frost had given way to brittle dust. Samuel sat at the table, sharpening a knife he hadn't used in months, not for the sake of the blade, but to quiet the hum in his chest. She opened her eyes like someone afraid of the light, not because it hurt, but because it meant she'd survived. He didn't say much, just passed her a tin cup of water and a piece of bread, which she took with hands that trembled but didn't hesitate. They sat like that for a while, the old man and the stranger, sharing a silence that felt less like absence and more like a truce. "My father owed men," she said eventually, her voice brittle, barely more than air. "He had no money, so he gave them me." Samuel didn't look up, just nodded once, slow and hollow. The knife stopped moving. "He said I wasn't worth much anyway," she added, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. Out the window, a red cloud began to gather on the horizon, hoofbeats maybe, or wind sweeping dry earth. But Samuel had lived long enough to know the difference. He stood and reached for the rifle hanging by the door, more out of instinct than intent. "You expecting someone?" she asked, not afraid, just tired. "No," he replied, "but trouble usually finds you when you're not." Emma, he'd learned her name only minutes before, didn't ask what he planned to do. She just watched him the way a soldier watches a storm roll in, resigned, not ready. "Did they ever trade you for something?" she asked suddenly, eyes fixed on his back. He didn't turn. "No, they just took me." A beat passed between them, heavy as dusk. In her, Samuel saw not a victim but a mirror. At 15, he'd been sold by his father for a debt of horses and whiskey. Locked in a boxcar, 2 states away before he even realized he wasn't going home. No one had come for him. No one had even noticed. But now there was someone tied to his fence, eyes like his had once been, and the dust on the horizon wasn't just weather. She wasn't. They sat through most of the night without speaking. The girl, Emma, wrapped tight in his dead wife's quilt, and Samuel, hunched over a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. The fire crackled between them, throwing shadows that danced like memories no one wanted. Eventually she spoke. Her voice was flat, like it had burned out long before the words ever formed. "His name's Marcus Devellin, my real father." The name meant nothing to Samuel at first. Then it landed, the kind of name that rode into towns with guns already drawn, the kind folks didn't say loud unless they had backup. Emma didn't flinch as she said it. That told Samuel everything. "He let me live in the back of a stable, said I cost too much to feed. When he drank, he remembered I existed. When he lost, he remembered why I did." Samuel said nothing, just stared into the fire like it might rewrite the past if he looked hard enough. Emma kept going, not because she wanted to, but because something in her had cracked and now the words were leaking out. "When I was 12, he tried to sell me to a man who bred fighting dogs. Said I'd learn discipline. Said it like it was a joke." Her voice didn't break, that's what caught him. She wasn't crying, she wasn't trembling, she was just done. And it made him furious. Not loud, red-hot fury, but the quiet kind that settles in your gut and rots everything soft. Samuel set his mug down too carefully, the clink of ceramic on wood louder than it should have been. "You ever hate someone so much," she asked, "that it eats you even when they're not there?" He didn't answer, just stood up, walked to the stove, poured water into a basin and brought it back. She didn't move, so he knelt and offered the cloth. She took it, wiped the dirt from her face in slow, deliberate strokes. When she finished, she handed it back and their fingers brushed. He hadn't touched another human in over a decade. Still no words. Just a shift in the room, like air rearranging itself around something unspoken. He remembered the tree his father had tied him to when he was 13. Said it'd make him a man. Left him out all night while coyotes howled. Samuel had learned to be still that night. Learned to stop asking for warmth. Now, decades later, a girl with broken wrists and eyes too old for her face sat in his home, not begging, not apologizing. Just there. And for the first time, he understood something about silence. Sometimes it's not what's left behind. Sometimes, by the time night folded itself over the plains, the cabin had gone quiet again. But it wasn't the peace of rest. It was the stillness before something breaks. The kind that sets dogs pacing and makes old bones ache. Samuel didn't light the lantern, just sat by the window, watching the open dark stretch toward them like a tide. Behind him, Emma stood by the table, her arms wrapped around her ribs like armor. He turned finally and placed the rifle on the table, the same one he hadn't touched in years. "Come here," he said gently. She hesitated, then stepped forward. He showed her how to open the chamber, where to place the cartridges, how to check the pin. His hands moved slow, not because she was delicate, but because the ritual mattered. He wasn't handing her a weapon, he was handing her choice. "You're not shooting to kill," he said. "You're shooting to stay yours." She looked at him, searching for something in his face. Maybe doubt. Maybe the trace of a man who didn't believe in her, but there was only stillness there, and something quiet like respect. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Samuel didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the drawer, pulled out a faded scarf, dark red, frayed at the edges, and tied it around her wrist. It used to belong to his mother. She'd worn it the day she'd hidden him behind the barn, away from a man drunk on rage. "If you're still standing tomorrow," he said softly, "make sure the rest of your story's yours, not his." Outside, the wind shifted, a hoofbeat. Then another, not fast, not loud, just enough to stir the air and tighten something in Samuel's chest. "They're here," Emma whispered. He nodded. "You go out back, stay behind the stable, low, quiet." "Is that where you—" He cut her off with a glance, not of anger, but of memory. "It's where I learned to stop waiting for someone to come save me." She didn't argue, just slipped into the dark like smoke. Samuel stood alone now, the fire behind him, the night ahead. And in that moment, he wasn't a rancher or a loner or a man past his prime. He was a wall, quiet. The knock didn't come. Instead, there was the slow creak of saddle leather, the quiet crunch of boots on gravel, and then a voice, calm, calculated, cruel. "Sam," it said, like they were old drinking buddies, "you got something of mine." Samuel didn't answer, just stood at the door, rifle in hand, breath even, not afraid, just aware. Outside stood Marcus Devellin, tall, broad, and wrapped in a coat that cost more than most men's lives. In one hand, a bottle of bourbon. In the other, a frayed length of rope swinging like a pendulum. And tucked beneath his arm, God help them both, a half-used stick of dynamite, its fuse already cut short. Samuel stepped out onto the porch. He didn't raise the gun, not yet. He knew what men like Devellin did when they felt cornered. You didn't threaten snakes, you waited. You bring explosives to a custody dispute. Samuel asked flatly. Devellin grinned, crooked and mean. "A daughter should know better than to wander off. Or maybe you've forgotten how things work out here." She didn't wander, she ran. "That's so." He glanced toward the barn. "Funny how she always ends up someone else's problem." There was a pause, taut as wire. "You planning to blow her up too?" Samuel asked. Devellin took a sip of bourbon, then tossed the bottle into the dirt. It shattered, the smell of alcohol sharp in the air. "Only if she makes me," he said. "Some kids are born broken. Best to end things quick before they infect the rest of us." Samuel's hands tightened on the rifle. "That why you beat her?" He asked. "She needed structure." "That what the rope's for?" Devellin shrugged. "Sometimes kindness looks like cruelty. You wouldn't understand." Samuel raised the rifle, not to fire, just to hold steady. "Walk away." "Or what?" Devellin laughed. "You shoot me, my boys burn this place down. You let her go, maybe I leave a piece of it standing. Your choice. There it was, the line in the sand. Samuel glanced toward the barn, just a flicker, but Devellin saw it. He smirked. She's there, ain't she? Samuel pulled the trigger, not to hit, just to disrupt. The shot rang out, echoing across the open plain and struck metal behind Devellin. Not him. Not yet, but close enough to send a warning. Devellin flinched, then chuckled. You've still got a little fire in you. Shame it's about to get smothered. One of Devellin's men stepped forward from the shadows, aiming low. Samuel turned and fired again, quicker this time, the recoil jarring but clean. That's when it happened. A stray bullet, maybe his, maybe theirs, hit the oil drum beside the cabin. It didn't explode, not right away. But the impact split it, oil spilling across the dirt like ink across parchment. The dynamite in Devellin's hand was still unlit, but now every breath felt like it might be the last. Samuel backed toward the cabin, heart hammering not from fear, but from the terrible knowledge. Smoke curled through the air, thin and bitter. The ground shimmered with spilled oil, unlit but threatening, and for a long, tight second, everything hung in a breath. Then Samuel did something that startled even the men aiming at him. He stepped forward and dropped his rifle. It hit the porch with a hollow thud, rolling once before stopping at his feet. Then he reached up, slow and deliberate, and peeled off his coat. Beneath it, his shirt clung to his back, soaked from sweat and heat. With one tug, the seam split. The fabric fell away just enough to reveal a tangle of old scars, thick, uneven, pale against sunburned skin. The kind of marks that didn't come from war but from something far more personal. Devellin's smirk faltered. I know what it means to be owned, Samuel said, his voice low but steady. To be told you're a thing, not a person. Just a cost, a burden. I lived 2 years in a pen meant for animals. The men around Devellin shifted, uncertain. My father sold me to a man named Harrow when I was 15, Samuel continued. Said I was too soft. That selling me was doing me a favor. He turned then, not fully, but just enough to show more of the damage carved into him. This is what that favor looked like. No one spoke. He stepped closer. She's not your property, Samuel said. She never was, and whatever piece of you still knows that, now's the time to listen to it. Devellin scoffed, but his hand twitched, not toward the dynamite, toward the rope. Like a habit he hadn't decided whether to break, Samuel didn't flinch. If you're her father, this is your last chance to act like it. Devellin's jaw clenched. For a moment he looked younger, no less cruel but less certain. His eyes darted to the barn, to the girl hidden behind it, then back to Samuel. This isn't mercy, he said, his voice quieter now. It's weakness. No, Samuel replied. It's what strength looks like when it's got nothing left to prove. Silence. Then Devellin let the rope drop. The dynamite followed, landing in the dirt like a stone. He didn't say another word, just turned slowly and walked back into the dark, the night swallowing him whole. And as the echoes of boots faded, Samuel stood alone on the porch, breath caught somewhere between relief and exhaustion. Behind him, Emma remained hidden, but something in the air shifted. The rope lay still in the dirt. The stick of dynamite hadn't moved, but it was the silence that said the most. thick and hollow, like a bell after the last toll. Devellin stood there for one last moment, jaw tight, eyes narrowed not in rage, but something more elusive, uncertainty maybe, or shame, though it wore thin on a man like him. Then, without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth sack. It jingled faintly as he tossed it at Samuel's feet. The dull thud was swallowed by the earth. "For her trouble," he muttered, and then he walked. No threats, no parting shot, just the slow steps of a man retreating from something he couldn't conquer. Samuel didn't touch the sack, didn't move at all until the dust settled behind Devellin's disappearing form. From behind the barn, Emma stepped out, cautious, hands tight at her sides. She didn't look scared, just hollowed out, like the storm had passed but left her gutted. She walked up to Samuel and stopped just behind him. Her hand reached out, soft and unsure, and came to rest between his shoulders, right where the worst of the scars ran deepest. He didn't speak. Neither did she, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been spoken in fire, rope, and silence. They didn't call each other anything. Not father, not daughter. But something had shifted in that touch, something unspoken that might have been trust, or at least the first breath of it. Samuel finally turned to face her. "You ready?" he asked. Emma nodded. No tears, no drama. Just a girl reclaiming her own weight, standing taller than she had since he'd found her. He picked up the old satchel from the porch, the one he hadn't touched in years, and handed it to her. "Carry this," he said. "You'll need it more than I do." They walked back into the house together, not for comfort, but to gather what little they had. The sack of silver lay untouched in the dust, left behind not out of pride, but because it had already been paid for in silence, in scars, and in the choice not to become what the world tried to make them. The sky was still dark when they saddled up. Not the kind of darkness that frightens, but the kind that feels like a deep breath before morning. The frost clung to the grass and a hush covered the land, one that wasn't silence but permission. Samuel tied down the last bag. No fanfare, no long glances back at the cabin that had been his home for 2 decades. Just a quiet pause, enough to know he'd finally outgrown the walls, the ghosts, the weight. Emma climbed onto her horse without help. Her hair was pulled back, her face calm, not because she felt safe, but because she no longer needed to ask if she was. Around her neck, tied loosely, was the red scarf, the same one she'd once used to clean blood from a rifle stock, now softened by wear and warmth. It was too big for her, too worn for fashion, but perfect for memory. Samuel noticed, said nothing, just adjusted his hat against the coming wind. They didn't speak as they rode out, Wyoming fading behind them like a scar that no longer ached but never quite vanished. Every hoofbeat was a heartbeat further from what they'd survived. Colorado lay ahead. No promises, no certainty, just space. And sometimes space is enough. Emma looked over once, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Is it always this quiet before the sun comes up?" she asked. Samuel smiled, faint. "Only on days that matter." They rode in tandem, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel presence. The stars thinned above them, the first breath of light stretching at the edge of the sky. Not full dawn, just a trace, like hope unsure of itself, but it was something.